Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. It was the advertisement's stark simplicity that caught my attention. Pioneer space exploration. Earned $20,000. National Space Agency. I wish I could say I didn't know why I called them. I wish I could say it was some act of fate or clever persuasion that drove me into their waiting arms. But that would be a lie. The truth is I called them because I wanted to explore space more than anything. Because I had washed out of flight school after a panic attack during a high-altitude training exercise. Because I was 6 months away from giving up my dream of ever leaving Earth's atmosphere. Because I didn't want to be forgotten. Who are they? I'm not exactly sure. In retrospect, their obvious evasiveness about their identity should have been a red flag to me. But at the time, their proposition seemed too intriguing, their opportunity too vital for me to risk losing the chance to help them. My best guess is that they're a specialized division of the National Space Agency, funded by some international coalition. They must be otherwise. There's no way they could have afforded the chamber they showed me. The chamber. The first time I met with them, it was kept in a cavernous room in the basement of a 10-story research facility. It was a work in progress at that time. They were still connecting conduits and calibrating sensors, but even in an unfinished state, it looked truly magnificent. Have you ever heard of sensory isolation, Mr. Novik, Doctor? Petrovsky asked. I had, in fact. I had actually been inside a sensory deprivation tank before. Back in my recovery period after washing out of flight school. Back then, I was on a real journey to rebuild myself, meditating daily, experimenting with biofeedback, primarily neurofeedback techniques. At some point along that journey, I felt motivated to spend 2 hours of my life and $100 of my savings inside a sensory deprivation tank at a wellness center outside of Houston. Your standard sensory deprivation tank is a large enclosed pod filled with about 10 inches of salt water. You step in, float in the water, then a technician, a wellness coach in my case, closes the pod so it's completely dark, with your vision obscured and your body suspended in the water. It's supposed to feel like you no longer have your primary senses. Depending on who you ask, this is supposed to be relaxing, enhance your creative thinking, allow you to reach altered states of consciousness, or maybe help you overcome trauma. My experience with the tank had been fairly lackluster. I remember that the water was too warm, and the salt made my eyes sting when I accidentally splashed myself. It was difficult to concentrate on clearing my mind when all I could think about was the cockpit I'd never sit in again. Truthfully, I did always wonder what it would be like to try it again with proper training, but I never had the opportunity. This isolation chamber didn't look anything like the one I'd used before. This chamber looked like a cracked-open space capsule, stretched across a massive metal platform. Hundreds of tubes and wires connected to the titanium body, which was about 2 times larger than my own. The head or the helmet of the chamber was enormous and spherical, with a carbon fiber pipe running out of its crown into the reinforced floor beneath it. On the walls surrounding the chamber were over 70 computer screens, 30 or so processing units, and various iterations of medical equipment that I couldn't identify if I tried. It dawned on me that the utility bills and computers alone for the chamber must have cost many times more than the 20,000 they offered me. Not to mention the salaries of the dozens of lab coat-clad scientists operating those computer screens. Again, perhaps this should have raised alarm bells, but I ignored it with the focused determination of a man who was watching his last chance to touch the stars slip away. The man who showed me the chamber introduced himself as Dr. Petrovsky. He was a straight-backed, silver-haired man with a neatly trimmed beard and intense eyes of slate gray. When I saw him, he was always clad in a pristine white lab coat over a dark suit. Dr. Petrovsky was the primary liaison for my involvement in this project. He explained the chamber's purpose, brought me the necessary consent forms, and answered all my questions. Questions like, "So, what exactly am I supposed to do? We want you to remain in our neural isolation chamber for 3 days." I'm sure my expression betrayed my sense of shock. 3 days? Is that, will that cause permanent damage? You probably would still be conscious after 3 days in pure isolation, though you would likely develop severe psychosis and suffer from extreme dehydration. However, the chamber will hydrate, feed, and otherwise sustain you during the experiment, so there is no risk of physical harm. Dr. Petrovsky went on to explain how the chamber worked. In your standard deprivation tank, the occupant is deprived of their sense of sight, feeling, and to a lesser extent, hearing. This deprivation, this process of shutting the outside world out from the occupant's mind, decreases the burden on their brain. Thus, the occupant's mind is free to wander more freely, to think more creatively, to undergo a deeper state of awareness. But there is a problem with standard sensory deprivation chambers. Although the brain is freed from most external stimuli, the visual and auditory, the brain will continue to be burdened by internal stimuli. That is to say, the brain is still very aware of its own carrier, the human body. The brain will still react to the hunger and thirst of the vessel that carries it. It will still process both the need for and the action of basic biological functions. These internal interruptions go on and on, but the point is that standard sensory deprivation chambers cannot truly be said to deprive the occupant of their senses. This chamber is not your standard sensory deprivation chamber, Dr. Petrovsky said, his accent thickening with pride. Even a cursory glance at the chamber made clear what the doctor meant. The inside of the capsule portion of the chamber is lined with a responsive polymer that will acclimate to maintain the exact temperature of human skin. The tubes and wires control and regulate a wide variety of bodily functions. Through these tubes, the body is automatically fed and hydrated. The essential functions of the body are handled with sophisticated medical technologies. A respirator automates breathing and regulates saliva production. Even the body's natural sense of touch is completely removed while in the chamber. This IV cord injects a specialized solution into the bloodstream that completely neutralizes all somatic perception. The neural inhibitor is the most critical component of our sensory deprivation process. The list went on and on. It became clear that they had truly accounted for everything. even for me. I was one of hundreds of applicants to be part of the experiment. For the first time in my life, I was the first choice candidate. The scientists explained to me that I had been chosen for 3 reasons. Number 1, you have no prior history of mental or physical illness that would make your experience in the chamber subject to confounding variables, said Dr. Elise Chang, a neurophysiologist on the team. Number 2, your height and weight are ideal matches to the chamber's specifications, although the neural inputs will need minor calibration. You are by far the closest match to our design parameters, Dr. Petrovsky added. And number 3, the most critical. There is nothing in your external life that would necessitate an early termination of the experiment, Dr. Chang continued. You have no significant personal attachments, no current employment, no immediate family obligations. We can proceed with confidence knowing that you will remain within the chamber for the entire duration of the experiment. Number 3 was important to the scientists. They had specifically designed the chamber to allow for 3 full days of isolation. If the chamber's process had to be interrupted early, it would take them weeks to reset the systems and run the experiment again. Unfortunately, reason number 3 also meant there was nobody to come looking for me. The intake process was thorough and meticulous. I signed what felt like hundreds of liability waivers. I listened to warning after warning about the potential side effects. Although our preliminary assessments indicate you have excellent psychological resilience, you should be aware the isolation process may be taxing, Dr. Chang explained. Our research suggests that disassociation, audio and visual hallucinations, temporal distortion, anxiety, existential crises, and other neuropsychological phenomena are potential effects. However, we believe such effects to be temporary and reversible. They had given me several weeks to prepare for the experiment. My only requirement during that time was that I didn't substantially change my body composition or develop any new health conditions. Somehow I managed. I spent those few weeks living normally, watching documentaries about space, applying for aerospace jobs, getting rejected for those jobs, and reading books about the cosmos. When the day came, I was nervous despite Dr. Petrovsky's efforts to prepare me. The process will unfold in phases, he explained, as technicians prep the chamber. At first, you may experience a mild state of disorientation. We anticipate that soon after, you will transition into an expanded state of consciousness for the remainder of the process. You will be alerted a few minutes before the experiment concludes by a brief audio signal. This way, you will emerge from your state of sensory deprivation gradually and be able to readjust without any risk of shock. He played the signal for me, which was a short musical sequence reminiscent of a satellite transmission. Then, with surprisingly little ceremony, I was asked to remove my clothing and enter the chamber. As I lay down inside the capsule, I felt the warm polymer against my bare skin. Even with the chamber still open, I was confined on all sides by the metal shell. Slowly, the researchers began to attach a multitude of medical devices to my body. I felt strangely detached through every insertion of an IV and uncomfortable placement of a sensor. But as a respirator was secured over my face, I began to feel a foreboding sense of dread. As my body was immobilized and held in place, a single thought filled my mind. Oh God, what have I done? The researchers pressed the helmet of the capsule inward on either side of my head, sealing off my ears. The world went silent. Beads of sweat began to trickle down my temples. Then I heard a voice, seemingly broadcast from inside my own skull. Hello, this is Dr. Petrovsky. I am speaking to you via a neuroacoustic interface contained within the helmet. Your vital signs indicate elevated stress responses. This is to be expected. Please try to relax while we complete the final preparations. I assure you that the process will become more comfortable shortly. Somehow, being told to relax just made me more agitated. Before I could respond, I felt the chamber close around my body. Already, the neural inhibitor being administered into my bloodstream was beginning to suppress sensory input from my extremities. I tried to push against the chamber, but found that my arms wouldn't respond. I tried to call out, but the respirator held my vocal cords immobile. I was paralyzed, unable to do anything except observe. I could still see as researchers moved around me, checking vitals and securing the capsule's final components. I could still see as a large digital display appeared on a screen above me and began to count down. 1 minute until deprivation begins. I tried again to shout. I tried again to plead to be released. I found myself unable to feel any part of my body. I strained my eyes, trying to catch someone's attention, but no one seemed to notice my panic. 30 seconds until deprivation begins. With no other recourse, I began to silently recite the astronaut's creed that I had memorized years ago, praying that this was the right decision after all. 5 seconds until deprivation begins. The last thing I saw was the face of Dr. Petrovsky leaning over me, nodding reassuringly, saying something I couldn't quite understand, closing the capsule's visor over my face. 0 seconds until deprivation begins. And then everything went dark. If I had been in control of my own breathing, I would have begun hyperventilating immediately. I had never experienced such profound darkness as in that moment, unable to see even my own body. It was as if I was being erased from existence. My eyes darted in every direction, searching for even the faintest glimmer of light, but found none. After a period of panic, I realized that I had now been in the chamber for some time. I had no reference point for exactly how long. Without external stimuli of any kind, my only mechanism for measuring time was counting individual seconds in my head. Yet time continued, and I found myself alternating between obsessing about my imprisonment and drifting through my thoughts. I began to reflect on the trajectory of my life, my failure at flight school, my abandoned dreams of space travel, my lack of close relationships. I felt a wave of melancholy sweep over me. Was my life really so inconsequential that I could vanish from existence for 3 days, and no one would even notice my absence? I pondered the source of my isolation. I recalled moments when I had pushed away colleagues after my failure, memories of friendships I had let atrophy out of shame and withdrawal. These images cascaded through my consciousness, and then I encountered a thought that, were my body not chemically immobilized, would have made me burst into laughter. I felt lonely. Well, of course I felt lonely. I was, at that moment, possibly the most isolated human being who had ever lived. There were undoubtedly researchers only yards from my physical form, but my mind had been completely cut off. I was as alone as a person could be. I let my consciousness continue to wander. It felt as though I had been in the chamber for hours at this point. Although I had planned to use this time constructively, mentally designing spacecraft innovations or solving engineering problems, I found my thoughts repeatedly circling back to my current predicament. Obsessively, I contemplated my body and the container that currently housed it. The neural inhibitor had been astonishingly effective. I couldn't detect the slightest movement of air in my lungs or the rhythm of my heart. It was then that a pair of intertwining thoughts collided in my mind. Could I be dead? No, of course not. That would be absurd. I knew exactly how I had arrived here. I knew that I had volunteered to participate in an experiment that would put me in precisely this situation. But I must admit, I no longer felt particularly alive. Without my body or the surrounding world as a reference point, I had no tangible assurance that I still existed. My thoughts began arguing with one another. Surely I'm not dead. This is exactly what the experiment was designed to do. If you're not dead, then why can't you feel anything? Why can't you feel your pulse or respiration or anything at all? But I know I'm not dead because I'm thinking right now. But what does that mean? I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I am. A more educated man could have told you who first said that. But I was left with just the statement from an unknown philosopher as the only proof that I was alive. As long as I was thinking, I existed. I began to visualize myself floating through the vacuum of space. The image manifested with startling clarity before my mind's eye. My body drifted silently. My arms extended as I soared past distant stars and unfamiliar planets. I watched myself navigate through asteroid fields and past swirling nebulae. I sensed the scorching heat of a dying sun and the absolute zero of deep space against my skin. Except I didn't actually feel those things. I had to remind myself of that fact. I was starting to imagine sensations that weren't actually there. I wasn't sure if I should resist these phantom feelings or simply embrace them for the duration of the experiment. Just one more question to contemplate, I supposed. At some point, I realized that I had been in sensory isolation for a significant period. Since I hadn't been systematically counting, it was impossible to know exactly how long. It felt like it had been days already. Had it been days already? That was a troubling thought. In a timeless void, 3 days stretched into an endless eternity. They had assured me that I would only be inside the chamber for 3 days. But how could I verify that time frame? Once I was sealed inside, I had no way of getting out. They could keep me here indefinitely. Maybe that was their plan all along. How could they get away with that? Who knows what all those liability waivers I signed actually said? I stopped reading them carefully after the 5th or 6th one. Maybe I had agreed to this extended captivity. You're being irrational, a part of my mind insisted. I don't know if I'm being irrational or not. I don't know how long I've been in here. So count. That was right. I only had one reliable way to measure how long I'd been inside the chamber. Counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And on I counted to 60. That was a minute. Then I counted another minute, and another, and another, and another. I just kept going, never losing focus on the task at hand. Eventually, I reached 1,000 minutes. Technically, 1,000 minutes was only about 16 and a half hours. Certainly not the 3-day period I was supposed to be inside the chamber. But that was 16 hours on top of all the time I had already spent reflecting on my life and imagining space travel. Surely I had spent longer thinking to myself than I had counting. I tried to estimate how long I had been in the chamber. It felt like I had been there for more than 3 days. I kept telling myself that I would be released from the chamber soon. I let my mind drift off again. My body was once more floating through the cosmos. I watched it drift farther and farther out into the endless void of darkness. The planets and stars shrank into oblivion until I was truly, deeply alone in the black abyss. A creeping sensation of cold began to set in. Its biting intensity spread up my legs and torso to my face. My exposed skin turned ashen gray and hardened into a crystalline shell as my body drifted further into the vacuum. I watched in horror as the surface of my abdomen began to crack. Slowly, fragments of my body began to break away and disperse into the darkness. With each expelled piece of myself, a new wave of agony cascaded through my consciousness. I found myself trying desperately to hold onto my disintegrating form, to reassemble the pieces. But my extremities were so brittle that they shattered at my touch. I tried to scream, but my throat had collapsed into itself. All at once, my body exploded into a constellation of jagged, frozen shards. The pain was indescribable. Then I was again alone in the darkness, but now without even the illusion of corporeality. Without lungs to expel the panicked breaths I was so desperate to release. I had to keep telling myself it wasn't real. I'm still alive. My body still exists somewhere. But God, didn't it feel real? But it wasn't real. Real or not, didn't it hurt? Yes. Are you afraid? Yes. Wait, do you hear that? I listened through ears that existed 1,000,000 miles away. A voice not my own materialized in my consciousness. Its familiar cadence was immediately recognizable. Hello, this is Dr. Petrovsky. I'm contacting you again via the neuroacoustic interface. I am pleased to inform you that you have successfully completed 3 days within the isolation chamber. I felt my terror instantly transform into profound relief. I tried to smile to little effect. At this juncture, we must update you regarding the status of your participation. The neurological data we're collecting from your brain activity is proving invaluable. The scientific implications for extended space travel are extraordinary. We have consulted with the project's ethics committee and received authorization to extend the experiment indefinitely. This is, of course, in accordance with the consent documents you signed previously. The chamber should be able to sustain your biological functions for several more weeks, until your neural pathways can no longer maintain coherence. Do not be concerned. $20,000 will nonetheless be deposited into your designated account. Thank you for your contribution. Your sacrifice will advance human exploration beyond our solar system. I tried to scream. I tried to thrash against my confinement, to protest against the doctor's proclamation. But my screams were silent. and my limbs no longer responsive. I felt a profound abyss of despair expand within me. Yet I would never truly feel anything again. I would die in this chamber. It would take weeks. Those weeks would feel like decades, and those decades would be unbearable. I again envisioned myself floating in an immeasurable darkness. There were no stars or planets now. There was only my consciousness, arguably alive but inexorably fading. I stopped counting seconds and simply let myself drift. My mind wandered again, this time for what seemed like an eternity. I imagined my childhood in rural Poland before my family emigrated, and visualized a future I would never experience. I created an imaginary list of achievements I would never accomplish, and felt sorrow for the possibilities I had lost. I staged conversations between former colleagues and mentors, and sometimes I didn't think at all. Sometimes I disappeared from awareness altogether. But then I felt something. I couldn't identify what it was at first. It had been so long since I had experienced any sensation that I couldn't determine if I was hallucinating it or not. It was in my left ankle. My left ankle somehow still had feeling. Not complete sensation. It felt like when circulation returns to a limb that's fallen asleep, as if it was being massaged by thousands of microscopic needles. I focused intensely on moving the ankle, the little that I could, trying to understand how this feeling had returned. Then I felt it, a tiny prick, the slightest spark of pain against my ankle. Something sharp, a sensor connector perhaps. It must have become dislodged somehow. Maybe one of those white-coated technicians knocked it loose. Or perhaps a system malfunction had occurred. All I knew was that I could feel again. I suddenly felt reborn, as if I had died and been resurrected. This sensor must have been one of the connections responsible for delivering the neural inhibitor to my lower extremities. Somehow it had been compromised, and now I had regained minimal sensation in my ankle. Unfortunately, my ankle was hardly the part of my body best suited to orchestrate a grand escape. But still I felt immeasurable hope because I had a secret advantage: time. There was an old saying that if you give a monkey a typewriter and infinite time, it will eventually produce the complete works of Shakespeare. Similarly, with a partially functional ankle and endless time to strategize, I could craft my liberation. My ankle was too weak to break through the capsule despite my continued efforts. I was unable to reach any other sensor to dislodge them. All I could access was the sharp edge of the disconnected sensor housing itself. With that tiny edge, I developed my desperate plan. I scraped my ankle against it repeatedly. Each movement brought stinging pain, but I knew it would serve my purpose. My efforts eventually created a laceration in my skin, and now I knew I stood a chance. The researchers had only two options. Let me bleed out, in which case I would at least be free from this nightmare, or extract me from the chamber, at least long enough to address the wound. Either way, my strategy was foolproof. Either way, I was going to escape, if only momentarily. It took them only minutes to detect my self-inflicted injury. This is Dr. Petrovsky again, communicating via the neuroacoustic interface. It appears you have sustained damage to your left tibial region. After consultation, we have determined it necessary to temporarily suspend the experiment and address this issue. Stand by. The capsule will be opened shortly. The light that soon flooded my vision nearly blinded me as the chamber opened. I basked in the cacophony of its mechanical whirs and the conversations of the personnel around me. The rapid removal of sensors and tubes from my body felt more exquisite than any sensation I had ever experienced. They had released me. I was free. My body remained largely unresponsive for hours. The neural inhibitor prevented me from making any significant movements during that time. The scientists left me secured in the open capsule as they analyzed their data and treated my injured ankle. I attempted to focus on their discussions, but found myself unable to concentrate. The bright lights above me seared my retinas, which had adapted to perfect darkness. As the inhibitor gradually metabolized, a profound ache developed throughout my nervous system. Eventually, my body was extracted from the capsule by a team of technicians. I felt a medical gown being placed over me. I was transferred to a wheelchair, still mostly immobilized. I listened to the sound of the wheels rolling across the polished floor as they pushed me deeper into their facility. Elaborate on your experience of spatial distortion during the isolation period, Doctor. Chang questioned. What precisely was the sensation like? Please let me go, I managed to whisper. I'm afraid that's impossible, Doctor, Petrovsky stated flatly. Surely you understand that the data we're extracting is too valuable to terminate prematurely. Lives are at stake, and besides, we cannot risk external disclosure at this stage. You will be returned to the chamber once your injury has been properly addressed. This interrogation continued for nearly 2 hours in a sterile examination room somewhere within the research complex's subterranean levels. Although I had regained sufficient neural function to speak, I still found coordinated movement challenging. It was evident that as soon as I ceased being useful to the researchers, I would be reinserted into the chamber until my inevitable neurological collapse. The data they had gathered thus far was apparently so groundbreaking that they had no ethical qualms about holding me against my will. As I sat in that cold examination room, restrained to a medical chair, dressed only in a thin hospital gown, I contemplated my fate. For $20,000, I had unknowingly surrendered the remainder of my life. My only consolation now was that I could delay returning to the chamber for as long as I could resist answering their questions. But I recognized I was merely postponing the inevitable. I stared down at my bandaged ankle, now properly treated and wrapped in sterile gauze. Somehow it had not occurred to me that even if I escaped the chamber, the researchers were unlikely to allow me to leave the facility alive, not after they decided to imprison me indefinitely. What if I refused to answer further questions? I asked suddenly. The neurological data we intend to collect from your subjective reports is critical and could revolutionize long-duration space flight, Doctor. Chang replied without emotion. However, if we cannot elicit these responses, the biometric information recorded by the chamber will be sufficient. If you won't cooperate, we will return you to isolation immediately. So it didn't matter. I was already condemned. I might as well delay for as long as possible. Fine. Ask me whatever you want. I answered countless questions, most of them multiple times. The interrogation seemed endless. The scientists barely acknowledged my responses. There was a recording device positioned in the room, and I suspected someone would analyze my testimony later. At present, the questioning appeared to be primarily for documentation purposes. At some point, however, I realized something crucial. The neural inhibitor had completely cleared my system. I could theoretically move again. For now, I was physically restrained to the chair, but they couldn't keep me immobilized if they wanted to return me to the chamber. From that realization, I formulated a plan. I knew I would only have seconds. I knew I couldn't escape immediately, or they would recapture me. I would need to convince them I had resigned myself to my fate. When the questioning finally concluded, I found myself being wheeled back to the chamber room. Perhaps assuming I would attempt to flee, the scientists kept me restrained during transit. But the restraints would have to be removed when it was time to place me in the capsule. They removed my hospital gown and lifted me toward the chamber. I allowed my body to remain limp, mimicking the same immobility that had until recently restricted my movement. As I was positioned in the polymer interior of the capsule, Dr. Petrovsky spoke through an overhead speaker. "I regret that we must part again so soon. Your testimony will be invaluable for future research. I understand it may appear that we're acting unethically, but the knowledge we're obtaining is truly revolutionary. It will transform human capabilities for space exploration. You are performing an essential service to humanity's future among the stars." As his speech concluded, his assistants approached to reconnect the multitude of sensors and tubes to my body. I was anxious to make my escape, but I remained patient. They needed to believe I was still incapacitated. I felt needle pricks in my right arm. They were already administering the neural inhibitor. My window of opportunity was rapidly closing. As several technicians approached from my left side to insert additional sensors, I launched myself upward, propelling my body out of the capsule. Surprised by my sudden movement, the nearest scientist stumbled backward. I felt sharp pain in my right arm as the IV lines and monitoring equipment tore free. The room erupted into chaos as personnel rushed toward me from all directions. My body moved with desperate instinct. My left hand reached toward the rolling cart of medical supplies and seized a scalpel. Blood sprayed onto the chamber as I severed remaining connections to my body. I vaulted from the platform and onto the floor, exposed as the day I was born. The neural inhibitor had already partially numbed my right side, but most of my body remained functional. I sprinted toward the heavy security door through which I had first entered the laboratory complex, what now seemed like a lifetime ago. I didn't dare look back to confirm if I was being pursued. All I could do was run. As I pushed through the door, I found myself in a long corridor that led to a series of ascending stairwells. Stairs I had climbed several times while preparing for the experiment. Stairs I had always assumed would eventually lead me to recognition and accomplishment, not desperate flight. I pushed my body beyond its limits. I ran with my right side increasingly unresponsive beside me until I reached the stairwell. Behind me, I heard the angry shouts of researchers and the pounding of their footsteps. I knew that if they captured me now, there would be no third chance. When I reached the stairs, I practically leaped up the entire first flight. As I turned to ascend the next section, I saw that only 3 men had managed to keep pace with me. Suddenly, I was filled with hope. Perhaps I could outrun them all, then contact the authorities and expose this entire operation. My hopes disintegrated as soon as I reached the second-floor landing. At least 12 security personnel blocked the building's main exit corridor, their expressions grim and determined. Clearly, my escape attempt had triggered emergency protocols, for which the facility was well prepared. As pursuers closed in behind me and guards approached from ahead, I knew there was only one direction left: upward. The emergency stairwell continued past the ground level all the way to the roof. I kept running, flight after flight, my aching body protesting each step, my partially paralyzed right arm banging against railings and walls as I ascended seemingly endless stairs. The sounds of pursuit never faded, angry voices and heavy footfalls filling the stairwell as I climbed higher and higher. Soon I reached the final landing. A metal ladder mounted to the wall led to a roof access hatch. That was it. I was going to see the open sky again. I didn't know where I would go once I reached the outside, but at that moment, I didn't care. I lunged for the ladder and pulled myself upward about 7 feet into the air. When I reached the top, I pushed against the hatch. It was heavy and barely moved. I strained against it with all my remaining strength, then felt a powerful grip close around my ankle. One of my pursuers had caught up. He had wrapped his hand around my leg and was trying to drag me from the ladder. I twisted slightly and saw it was Dr. Petrovsky himself, his face contorted with fury, his eyes wide and bloodshot. It was like looking into the eyes of a man possessed. I reacted purely on instinct. My grip on the ladder tightened, and I swung my free foot at the doctor's face. As my heel connected with his jaw, sending a spray of blood across the wall, I couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. It hurt tremendously, but it felt incredible to inflict something real. Dr. Petrovsky released his grip. I pushed upward again, and the hatch finally gave way. I scrambled onto the flat roof of the research facility. A layer of crushed stone covered the rooftop, the sharp edges cutting into my bare feet, but I barely noticed the pain. I ran to the edge of the roof and looked out at the horizon. A breathtaking panorama of mountains and forest stretched before me, with the sprawling research complex laid out below. I felt the cool morning breeze against my exposed skin. The shouts of the men behind me barely registered as I climbed onto the low wall at the roof's edge. I must have been a striking sight to anyone watching from the grounds below. A naked man poised at the brink of a 10-story drop, gazing at the sunrise as if seeing one for the first time. "Please step down from there immediately, Doctor," Petrovsky called out, his words slurred from his injured mouth. "You don't have to return to the chamber. We simply need you to cooperate." It was Dr. Petrovsky again, his voice difficult to understand now that several of his teeth were missing. I turned away from the horizon to look at him. He was surrounded by security personnel in tactical gear. I knew at that moment that I had no real options left. Could I believe Dr. Petrovsky that he wouldn't force me back into the chamber? Probably not, but I had no clear path to escape. There were too many of them, and nowhere for me to go. Just as one of the security officers cautiously approached, I took a step backward. As my body plummeted toward the earth below, I found myself laughing. It was just like when I was in the chamber. My body was floating once again. The cold air numbed me, and once more I couldn't feel a thing. Just before I struck the ground, I heard the sound of a satellite transmission beeping in my ears. Salvation, I thought. I must be on my way home. No salvation came. Instead, I found myself in complete darkness, feeling nothing, seeing nothing, simply contemplating my actions. Is this what death feels like? In answer to my question, I heard a familiar voice. Hello, this is Dr. Petrovsky. I am speaking to you once again, via the neuroacoustic interface. You have successfully completed your 3 days within the isolation chamber. Had I still not been immobilized by neural inhibitors, I would have wept. We are currently in the process of opening the chamber. At that point, we will perform a complete physical assessment. I understand you are eager to exit the facility. I can assure you we will proceed as efficiently as possible. Thank you again for your participation in this groundbreaking research. It will be invaluable to the future of space exploration. 3 days. I had been in that chamber for exactly 3 days. It didn't register in my mind until they were extracting me from the machine. There was no injury on my ankle, no sensor dislodged from my foot on which I could have cut myself. The facility staff was nothing but professional and attentive in the hours after the experiment concluded. Although they asked numerous questions about my experience, they were respectful when I declined to answer immediately. The researchers readily responded to my inquiries about what had happened, explaining that it had all been an elaborate hallucination. In the days following the experiment, Dr. Petrovsky ensured that I received comprehensive psychological support. He connected me with a therapist specializing in extreme psychological experiences, whom I have been seeing for several weeks. The therapist prescribed an anti-anxiety medication that I take twice daily. I've returned to something resembling my normal life. My apartment lease is renewed, and I've begun dating someone I met at a space exhibition. I even secured a position at an aeronautics company working on life support systems. It's like all of my aspirations have suddenly materialized. But no matter how many therapy sessions I attend, and regardless of how many pills I swallow, I can't purge the chamber from my consciousness. I can't stop obsessing over how those 3 days seem to stretch into infinity. But you're out of the chamber now. Your 3 days are complete. Yes, but what? I thought I had escaped the chamber once before, but that wasn't real. But this feels real, doesn't it? I don't know anymore. Could 3 days feel longer still? Could I be imagining a therapist, a job, a better life? I just don't know. Sometimes I close my eyes and become too terrified to open them, because I'm afraid that when I do, I will see only darkness. I'm terrified I'll find myself still floating, motionless, among those imaginary stars. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. Good evening. My name is Layla. I grew up in a small town with mild weather, dirt roads, and simple houses. Most of the homes were built with repurposed materials, and the fences were made from logs tied together with wire. My childhood memories revolve around my mother's kitchen and the backyard where my two brothers and I would run around at the end of the day, when we weren't helping with chores like peeling vegetables or feeding the chickens. We had limited financial resources while I was growing up, but my mother always found a way to bring home used books bought cheaply at second-hand markets. She enjoyed reading about almost everything: adventure stories, romance novels, even volumes with recipes and folk remedies. They said my grandmother had been a midwife and healer in another state, but I never knew her myself. My mother's love of books passed on to me. I read whatever was available: children's stories, comic books, advertising pamphlets, anything with words. When I was about 13 years old, my best friend Marcia found an old notebook in her grandfather's attic. One day she showed up at my door, excited, holding this dust-covered object. The binding had a thick paper cover full of dark marks and bore symbols that made no sense to us. We decided to examine it together, half curious, half scared. The pages spoke of protection rituals, confusing prayers and references to entities we'd never heard of. Despite our fear, I became fascinated. I copied down some passages that spoke of powerful prayers or formulas to ward off negative energies. Not because I wanted to practice them then, but out of pure curiosity. My teenage years unfolded with this mix of curiosity, blended with 1 foot in reality. I helped at home, went to school, read my books, and kept those few notes about magic hidden away. It wasn't something I discussed with just anyone, as many people around me frowned upon the subject. After a few years, I completed high school in the village and decided I wanted to experience life elsewhere. I got a temporary job at a local grocery store, saved money for about 2 years, and around my 22nd birthday, I decided to move to a city known for its mystical atmosphere. I won't go into details about the place itself, as everyone who lives there already knows its reputation: healers, people who say special prayers, some who promise to break spells of envy. I arrived with my suitcase, some cash, and my books, including my old notebook of annotations. I soon found work in a restaurant, where I started as a kitchen assistant. The salary was tight, but allowed me to afford a room in a modest boarding house. I enjoyed the work environment. My coworkers were friendly, and the routine was demanding but honest. After several months, I managed to rent a small independent house with a yard and 2 windows facing the street. It seemed like a dream to have my own space, even if modest. The street where I settled was quiet. Neighbors spoke little, only greeting each other in passing. Next door lived an elderly man named Antonio, known for sitting every afternoon in a wooden chair drinking tea. He was tall, thin, and kept his hair neatly cut. He had a calm demeanor that reminded me of the older uncles from my village, always ready for good conversation. Initially, we only exchanged good afternoons and nothing more. After a few weeks, when he saw me arrive from work with heavy shopping bags, he offered to help. "Let me carry those for you." "No need, I can manage." "Thank you, don't worry, girl, I have plenty of time out here." I accepted, and he carried the groceries with ease. We spent a few minutes talking about the weather and the yard plants. He mentioned he'd worked in various trades and was familiar with this place's reputation. where many people seek spiritual help. It was the first of several friendly conversations to follow. In the following months, whenever I passed by his house, he would smile and ask something about my routine at the restaurant. He seemed genuinely interested in helping. Sometimes I arrived late, as business picked up on Friday and Saturday nights. Antonio would see me pass and tell me to be careful, because some streets became deserted late at night. I'd thank him and enter my house, happy to have a polite neighbor. One day I arrived exhausted from the restaurant. It was past 10 o'clock at night. Antonio called me from the gate, saying he'd prepared soup. There was plenty left, and he asked if I'd accept a bowl. My stomach rumbled immediately, since I hadn't stopped for dinner. I went to his kitchen, which surprisingly was organized, and had an aroma of spices and herbs I didn't immediately recognize. We talked while I had the soup. He explained that he'd lived in various regions, and had found in that city a place to stay undisturbed. When I finished eating, Antonio changed his tone. He said I seemed to have a different energy, something that distinguished me from other people. I didn't quite understand, but he insisted I should consider seeking protection methods. He also said he could teach me some practices if I wanted to advance professionally or defend myself against anything harmful. Initially, I thought it was just casual conversation. I thanked him but said I didn't need help. From then on, I noticed he began observing me in an almost fixed way, barely blinking, as if interpreting my every gesture. One weekend, he saw me arrive tired with grocery bags and didn't offer to help. Instead, he stared at me in silence. I felt uncomfortable, but couldn't respond beyond a quick nod. I went inside and closed the door. In the following nights, when I returned from work, he'd stand in the yard or sit in his chair, but wouldn't greet me. There was something different in his expression, like resentment or irritation. A few days later, I began hearing noises in the wall dividing our houses, scattered cracks and knocks. At first, I thought it was a door not properly closed or wind moving something, but it persisted, especially at dawn. I asked aloud if everything was okay, but heard no response. The routine became strange. I'd leave early for work with my head spinning. The restaurant job demanded energy preparing ingredients, serving, cleaning, and I'd return home exhausted, without the spirit to question my neighbor. Until one Sunday night, arriving home, I noticed Antonio leaning against the fence between our yards. He said nothing, just followed me with his eyes until I went inside. I closed the door and sat on the couch, trying to distract myself with a book. Minutes later, I heard a dragging sound in the wall. It sounded like furniture being moved, then silence. I tried to sleep, but found myself staring at the ceiling for hours. The next night, the same thing happened. I started locking doors and windows, but still heard noises in the middle of the night, followed by a muffled laugh that left me confused. I remembered that years ago, I'd noted in my notebook some protection rituals, more out of curiosity than belief. I decided to take a look. I found a passage that spoke of lighting white candles, using a handful of coarse salt, repeating prayers. I tried it, creating a small circle of salt in the living room. I turned off the lights and recited the phrases quietly. Nothing happened immediately, but the night passed without noises. I believed the problem might be solved. However, the following week I returned to having nightmares and a constant feeling of tension. I began to think someone was in the yard, as almost every day I found overturned plant pots or dirt tracks near the back door. I thought it might be an animal, but there were no holes or droppings. Once I saw a human shadow beyond the wall. I couldn't tell if it was really him, but the posture was similar. I was afraid to go check. By this point, my behavior change was visible at the restaurant. I made mistakes with orders. My boss commented that I seemed distracted. I confided in a colleague, Sylvia, that I had a strange neighbor but didn't give details. Sylvia only asked if I wasn't considering moving. I didn't have resources to change houses again, and this made me feel even more vulnerable. I thought about going to the police, but hesitated, having no concrete evidence and fearing they wouldn't take seriously what seemed like something supernatural mixed with nocturnal invasions. On a Tuesday around midnight, I heard sharp knocks on my window. I got up startled and went to check. I saw no one. My heart raced. I decided to do a quick search of the yard. I opened the door carefully and searched with my phone flashlight, only to come face to face with Antonio crouched beside the plants. He looked at me as if I were the intruder. I felt my legs nearly give way. Then he jumped the fence in a movement that seemed too agile for someone his age. That shocked me. For a moment, I thought it wasn't normal for such a thin, elderly man. I slammed the door, putting on the latch. I tried to sleep, but the night was terrible. The next day, I wasn't sure whether to call the police for trespassing, as I hadn't been directly assaulted and hadn't recorded any evidence. The day after, I again found dirt spread in the house corridor. I developed insomnia. When exhausted, I'd doze off and dream of a male figure watching me at the foot of the bed. I'd wake up disoriented, not knowing what was dream or reality. I remembered the nocturnal noises, Antonio's insistence on talking about my energy. I decided to seek a local healer, Donna Felicia, who attended clients in a simple house at the end of the main street. I explained without details that I felt like I was under some harmful influence. She welcomed me and said sometimes people who work with unknown practices can create an unwanted connection. She performed a cleansing on me, praying quietly and using herbs and holy water. She said I truly carried a heavy vibration, but this alone might not solve everything. I bought a small amulet from her to place on my house door. I thought about returning to tell her about the invasions, but felt apprehensive about having to pay for more sessions, besides feeling ashamed of the whole situation. That night when I arrived, I saw Antonio sitting again in the same chair. He raised his head and followed me with his gaze, but said nothing. I went inside, turned on all the lights, put the amulet on the doorknob, and tried to eat something. In the middle of the night, I woke to knocks on the back door. Since I had placed a shelf to block the passage, they couldn't open it, but the noise continued for a few seconds, then stopped. I spent the rest of the night awake. On the weekend, arriving from work near 11 at night, I found the gate unlocked and some muddy footprints by my entrance. I cleaned everything angrily, but also with fear. Then I remembered a ritual I'd noted years ago, something about returning bad intentions. The idea was to reverse any attack to its origin. I'd always thought this was exaggerated, but I didn't know what else to do. I gathered the materials: candles, salt, some dried herbs Dona Felicia had given me. I waited until midnight, closed curtains and windows, turned off the lights, and sat in the living room with everything ready. I prayed quietly, asking only to be left in peace. I mentally connected each ingredient to what I felt coming from that neighbor. It was a strange experience, a mix of faith and terror. I felt unwell, as if doing something risky. Outside, I stopped hearing any noise. When I finished, the candles still burned, and I remained motionless until the flame went out. Then I exhausted my strength and slept on the couch. In the following nights, I noticed Antonio had disappeared. I was curious if he was at home, but a neighbor mentioned he'd been hospitalized. Some said he already had frail health and was seen by doctors occasionally, which could have suddenly worsened. I had a mix of pity and relief. I didn't know if the ritual had anything to do with it, or if it was just coincidence. Still, I slept better for a few days. However, the situation gained a darker ending. About a week later, they announced on the street that the elderly man had died in the hospital. Others added they found strange objects in his house: notebooks with symbols, bottles with ancient liquids. Some even found photographs of unknown people. I didn't involve myself in the conversation. I listened quietly, remembering each time he stopped me to talk about my energy. Each time he positioned himself in my yard at night. It took me a while to digest what happened. I felt remorse for somehow having done something that might have hastened his health problems. At least that's what passed through my mind. On the other hand, I saw no other way out of that silent persecution that deprived me of sleep and threatened my sanity. As time passed, I returned to having more peaceful days and nights. I gradually occupied myself with fixing the yard damage, changed the gate lock, repaired windows with loose latches. I continued working at the restaurant. My colleagues noticed I was more relieved, though still somewhat quiet. I didn't want to elaborate on the story. I just said my neighbor had had problems on some nights. In occasional dawns, memories of those noises in the wall and muddy footprints still came to me. Some rumors arose that, before dying, he had warned the hospital staff about a person who wouldn't leave him in peace. I didn't learn the details. It seemed everyone around preferred to forget the matter. Months passed, and his house was closed with chains. Some people entered to remove furniture and sell or donate. I'm not sure exactly. Occasionally, a dog crosses the street and barks stopped in front of the empty gate. But there are no more chairs on the porch or signs of tea. I still keep my notebook of magic annotations at the bottom of a closet. I never intend to use it for anything similar, but I don't have the courage to throw it away. I keep it as a reminder that sometimes, when no one can help us, we end up resorting to solutions we never imagined. The restaurant carries on. I'm saving money to perhaps move to a bigger place in the future. I still think about what happened, and I'm not sure if everything was coincidence or if there was an unknown force there. What matters is that my life returned to normal. People comment that I seem more serious, but I feel safer at night. When I lie down to sleep, I no longer hear noises in the yard. And if someday a new neighbor appears around here, I wish they would only bring the kind of simple coexistence everyone deserves. Good evening, Dom. My name is Marcus. I was born and raised in a small farming community where my family owned an orchard and a feed supply store. We grew gradually, but never wanted to leave that place. My father, Richard, was the kind of person who believed that a family's roots were as important as the soil they cultivated. My mother, Martha, used to say that what mattered most was keeping your heart light, regardless of where you were. She passed away about 2 years ago after battling a prolonged illness. It left a void that my father never truly managed to fill. During the first year after her death, my father still tried to maintain his routines. He'd tend to the orchard in the early morning hours, as he always had, then head to the feed store. It was as if he was clinging to her memory through his work. But with time, he began to lose interest. He'd spend many hours in the store office behind closed doors, staring at papers without really reading them. I did my best to handle the administrative part. I decided to take online business courses while also managing the fruit sales we made weekly. I was trying to lighten his load while also escaping the grief that lingered in our house. When the harvest began that year, I needed to hire new staff for the feed store. Interviewing candidates was never my strong suit, but I knew I had no choice. My father was completely unmotivated, both for managing employees and organizing sales. It was during this period that Rebecca appeared. She came on a regular day, almost at dusk. She said she had experience in bookkeeping and knew how to manage inventory. She spoke with impressive confidence, pointing out details that only someone observant would notice. I found it curious how she looked around, as if she already knew the place better than I did. I remember feeling a twinge of unease, but I didn't dwell on it at the time. We needed someone who understood finances, and she seemed to fit the bill. Look, I'm happy to work in a place like this, close to nature. My last job was at a company in the city, but I couldn't adapt to the rush there, she said. My father just watched our conversation without speaking much. I was honest and explained that the job went beyond finances, as we also needed someone to receive shipments, guide delivery drivers, and organize the flow of inventory. Rebecca smiled and said it wouldn't be a problem, that she could handle all of that. Deep down, I saw a certain gleam in her eyes, as if she was already planning much more than I could imagine. We ended up hiring Rebecca. At first, her performance was flawless. She organized cost spreadsheets, negotiated better terms with some suppliers, and even took care of renewing some old records at the feed store. In a way, I felt grateful to have someone helping. However, I noticed that my father became extremely close to her. Several times, when I'd arrive at the store, I'd find them in a conversation more intimate than the situation warranted. Rebecca would speak softly, gesture slowly, and my father would pay attention to every word as if entranced. As the months passed, I noticed my father was beginning to accept everything she suggested, without even consulting me. Once, I noticed she had been handling the property deed paperwork. There were transfer documents and blank powers of attorney. When I questioned my father, he just shook his head and said it was a way to facilitate future negotiations. This worried me, as I'd never heard about selling even part of the orchard. Dad, why exactly do we need a power of attorney? He took a while to respond, as if searching for a justification. Finally, he said he wasn't sure, but Rebecca had mentioned it would be useful if we wanted to expand the feed store. I felt something strange. Since when did we make expansion plans without sitting down to discuss it as a family? At the same time, my father began to feel unwell frequently. He'd complain about body aches, persistent fatigue, and would even pass out on the office couch out of nowhere. Although he'd been a healthy man until then, he started losing weight for no clear reason. Rebecca would show up at the house every day with soups and teas. She'd say they were traditional recipes that helped strengthen the body. When I tried to convince my father to see a doctor, she'd appear smiling and say that the doctor would only prescribe medicines full of chemicals that wouldn't solve anything. "Don't you trust me, Marcus? It's not about trust. I just think he needs a professional diagnosis. I swear it's nothing serious. You'll see how he'll improve," she'd insist. I was helpless because my father himself didn't want to go to the hospital. He'd say it was all just a passing ache, an emotional ailment due to missing my mother. However, he kept becoming more distant. Several weeks passed with this routine of discomfort. One afternoon, I found a peculiar object in a corner of the yard. It was a bundle made with dry leaves, tied with a brown cord. Inside were what appeared to be small pieces of fabric and ashes, plus strands of hair that definitely weren't my father's. I was disturbed. I showed it to him, but he just shrugged, saying he didn't know what it could be. A few days later, I discovered that Rebecca had taken several important papers from the office. When I asked her, she explained she was expediting the documentation, but didn't detail anything. My father, showing no reaction, simply stated he trusted her. This made me furious, but I didn't know how to act without creating a bigger conflict. The situation truly began to unravel when he started having disturbing dreams. I'd hear him at dawn, mumbling unintelligible things. In the morning, he could barely remember anything, only saying he'd dreamed of a woman asking him for something, as if she wanted him to yield to a request he couldn't understand. He'd wake up with a mild fever, shaking, but refused to go to the hospital. Rebecca was always nearby, saying those symptoms were part of a purification process, that soon everything would improve. Meanwhile, I took the initiative to seek out Mrs. Eva, a well-known healer. She lived just a few miles away. We talked about my father's behavior, about Rebecca, and the strange discoveries I'd been making. Mrs. Eva listened attentively while stirring an herbal stew over a wood stove. After thinking for a moment, she said she dealt with situations of manipulation that involved items placed in the house or food to weaken a person and facilitate control. She recommended some sprigs of rue and a cloth soaked in an herbal mixture. She asked me to place it behind my father's headboard without him noticing. She also advised me not to speak openly about this matter, as if Rebecca was involved in something more serious. Confronting her without proof could be dangerous. I followed Mrs. Eva's advice. That night, I secured the cloth to the bed frame, trying not to make noise. In the morning, I noticed my father had a different coughing fit, but soon improved. Rebecca, however, seemed uncomfortable in the kitchen. She appeared quieter than usual. That same day, she insisted on preparing a strange juice for my father, insisting I try it too. I thanked her but politely declined. It was enough for her to look at me in a way I can't quite describe. It wasn't an explicit threat, but I had the distinct feeling that she had sensed something. Gradually, the atmosphere in the house became heavy. Rebecca practically moved in, sleeping in a guest room. It no longer made sense for me to question this, as my father blindly trusted her. At the same time, his health showed signs of decline. Some days he simply couldn't get out of bed. Other times, he'd appear slightly better and manage to go to the feed store office to sign papers, though always very tired. It was as if there were brief intervals of improvement before he'd fall back again. I handled most of the orchard and store work because I couldn't abandon our customers. When I'd return home, I'd find Rebecca in the living room or kitchen, always acting like she owned the place. She'd spend hours in the private office, among documents and spreadsheets that used to be my responsibility. When I questioned her, she'd respond vaguely, saying she did it at his request. You know your father isn't in condition to handle these things now. It's better for someone trustworthy to manage it, right? One Sunday morning, I received an urgent call from Robert, a lawyer who was an old family friend. He warned me about suspicious movements of some property papers and assets in my father's name. It seemed someone was starting processes to value and then sell part of the orchard. I didn't understand how this was possible without my signature or my father's. Did you see my father there, Robert? Yes, I did, but he only showed up to sign what the woman indicated. He hardly spoke, he replied. I was distraught. However, Robert also mentioned noticing a signature that didn't look like my father's on a certain power of attorney. He suspected Rebecca had help from someone to authenticate documents with forged signatures at the notary office. This disturbed me even more. That same day, I decided I would demand explanations. Confronting Rebecca in front of my father would only generate arguments, so I waited for a moment when she'd be alone in the office. I entered and saw her handling a manila envelope full of official documents. Where did you get these? She stepped back and placed the envelope on the desk. Your father authorized me to handle these matters. Don't look at me like I'm an intruder. You are an intruder, Rebecca. It doesn't make sense to touch family property deeds. What do you want? You're wasting time. If we don't reorganize things, taxes and fees will destroy the orchard. I'm just helping, she replied. We nearly got into an argument, but Rebecca quickly changed her tone, claiming everything was under control. She said my father was an older man who needed someone to coordinate finances, especially after my mother's death. When I left the office, I felt anger and helplessness because nothing I said changed the situation. The following week, my father had a severe crisis and ended up in the nearby city's emergency room. It took almost 10 days to convince him to go, as he always avoided it. Rebecca wanted to accompany us in the car, but I insisted on going alone. I was firm and said we didn't need that many people at the hospital. She stayed quiet, but didn't look at me as we left. During the consultation, my father's tests didn't show any specific problem that explained such weakness. The doctor said it could be a psychological state, aggravated by lack of vitamins and stress. My father didn't want to be admitted, so we returned home. As soon as we parked, Rebecca appeared with a glass of a dark liquid, saying it would solve everything. Enough of these things, Rebecca. He just got out of the hospital. He needs to take the medicines the doctor prescribed. Pharmacy medicines always harm other organs, Marcus. I trust natural methods a bit more. My father, even tired, took a sip of the liquid while looking at me in a confused way, as if he didn't understand why I was so outraged. Later, he slept so deeply that I was scared. If the dosage of what she gave was too strong, it could even cause something serious. But I had no concrete proof of anything. So I continued trying to find a way to act. I met with Mrs. Eva again. I took a little of the liquid Rebecca had prepared, stored in a bottle. Mrs. Eva analyzed the smell and color, but couldn't identify exactly what it contained. She said only that if the bitter taste suggested a regular tea, it could be from some herb that induces drowsiness. She advised me to continue protecting myself, and above all, strengthen the idea of seeking legal help, as something bigger seemed to be at stake. I knew Rebecca's power wasn't only in supposed witchcraft. She seemed to have experience with fraud and document manipulation. I don't know if she was part of some group or specific cult, but the meticulous way she acted gave me that impression. Although I didn't see impossible phenomena, the entire atmosphere in the house was strangely heavy. There were times when I'd arrive and feel chest compression for no apparent reason. One day, I returned from the feed store early and saw Rebecca in the yard, walking back and forth as if checking something on the ground. She seemed to be planting small objects in specific corners. When she saw me, she quickly hid what was in her hands and went into the house. I didn't know how to react. "What were you doing out there?" she smiled. "Just collecting some branches to prepare tea." Nothing special. I didn't insist but stayed alert. The next night, I took a flashlight and went to check the yard. I searched carefully until I found a glass jar partially buried near a patch of grass. Inside the jar was a rolled paper with reddish stains and what looked like fine sand. I put everything in a bag and tossed it in my car trunk. I thought about taking it to Mrs. Eva, but preferred not to bother her at dawn. The next day, I woke up to my father complaining about sharp stomach pain. I stayed by his side, trying to see if the pain would pass, but nothing improved. Rebecca claimed she'd make a special tea. That's when I gathered courage and said that from then on, any medication would be given by a doctor or Mrs. Eva, but not by her. She looked at me in silence and left the room. With Robert's help, my father and I managed to block the possibility of selling the orchard, at least temporarily. He discovered there were forgeries in progress and reported them at the notary office. I was confident this would prevent Rebecca from continuing with her plans, but she didn't back down. Instead, she began ignoring me and strengthening her influence over my father. She told him I was trying to make all the decisions alone, that I didn't respect his wishes, and that my mother, if she were alive, would approve of her ideas. It was a cruel move. After so much resistance, I managed to take my father to stay a few days at our cousin's house to help him rest and get away from Rebecca. His crisis was worsening again, and the doctor recommended he avoid any source of stress. Surprisingly, Rebecca accepted the move without fighting, saying she also needed to put some things in order. We left that afternoon. Leaving her alone in the house was risky, but I was more concerned about protecting my father from a serious relapse. When we arrived at my cousin's house, My father slept for more than 12 consecutive hours. Without the routine of potions and teas, I noticed he woke up more alert the next day, though still confused. Meanwhile, Rebecca remained at our house, supposedly taking care of everything. This decision would haunt me later, because leaving her there wasn't smart in terms of document security. Robert advised me to file a request to force her to leave, citing abuse of trust. The process would take time, but it was a path. One afternoon, when we returned to get clothes and documents, I found Rebecca in the kitchen, trying to open the locked drawer where my father kept some property deeds. As soon as she saw me, she pretended and made a gesture to leave the room. I asked to talk. "We're closing in on you. You know that, don't you? I have no idea what you're talking about. We've already managed to prevent any sale of our land, and the rest is just a matter of time. I think you're getting ahead of yourself. Your father still trusts me, and there's nothing illegal in what I'm doing." I took a deep breath and held back the urge to throw her out by force. I left there, called Robert, and asked him to speed up the process papers. The next day, I got confirmation that the injunction would be issued soon. I immediately sought support from local police to ensure that when the injunction was served, she'd be removed from the property without resistance. In the meantime, the house was filled with signs that she wasn't willing to give up. One evening, a neighbor saw someone who looked like Rebecca pouring a liquid on the main gate. In the morning, the foliage around was wilted, as if it had been burned by a chemical product. No one could explain it. On another occasion, the house alarm went off at dawn without any sign of invasion. The system was all reconfigured, as if someone had tampered with it to cause failures. Finally, the following week, the injunction was issued. I managed to have 2 officers accompany Robert and me to the location. When we arrived, Rebecca was sitting on the porch, staring into space. One of the officers read the document, and she simply stood up calmly, saying she'd gather her things. She didn't protest or yell, but gave me a look that made me feel an unease difficult to define. She murmured something too low for me to understand and walked toward the waiting car. Only then did I release the breath I'd been holding for several moments. In the following days, I dove into a real cleaning of the house and feed store. I found small bundles of herbs and strange-looking objects under beds, behind doors, even inside plant pots. I collected everything in plastic bags. I kept showing my father, who was beginning to get more lucid. He didn't remember allowing any of that. He even became embarrassed and looked guilty for trusting Rebecca so much. Robert managed to cancel all suspicious transactions. Only a long paperwork remained to reorganize. Even so, the emotional damage was already done. At home, some walls needed painting because there were dark spots where her pictures and objects used to hang. In the orchard, some trees seemed drier without apparent explanation. On one of these cleaning days, I found a dead bird near one of the buried jars. Apparently, it had swallowed part of the contents. This made me even more convinced that something strange was happening. I decided to call Mrs. Eva to do a spiritual cleansing. She came and blessed every corner. There was no explicit supernatural scene, but the feeling of lightness was clear as we finished. My father gradually recovered. He started spending more time sitting on the porch, sunbathing. He returned to help me at the feed store gradually, avoiding excessive physical efforts. It was visible that he was disappointed with himself, but I never blamed him. My mother's death had left him very vulnerable. Anyone who arrived with an air of competence and care would certainly be welcomed, even without clear evidence of something paranormal. I couldn't help noticing the succession of coincidences and strange occurrences that came along with Rebecca. There was no way to prove she was part of some obscure group, but her behavior pattern and actions left marks that simple reason couldn't explain. One day, while cleaning the yard, I found one last buried jar near the fence. Inside were a rolled paper and a dried plant. The paper had symbols I didn't recognize. I was tempted to burn everything, but was afraid of burning any chance of clarification too. I took it to Mrs. Eva, who kept it without saying much. Perhaps she knew what it was, but preferred not to tell me. Several months passed, and everything seemed to be returning to normal. The orchard began bearing better fruit, recovered from the strange period we'd been through. The feed store got loyal customers back, and my father resumed part of the administration, though he'd consult me on everything to avoid repeating past mistakes. Sometimes we'd receive anonymous letters with veiled threats, but Robert followed all legal procedures, reinforcing the legal security of our properties. During all this restructuring, sometimes I'd remember Rebecca walking through the house, opening drawers, talking with my father so calmly as if she were family. I'd think about how much fragility exists when we're grieving. It became clear to me that ill-intentioned people take advantage of these emotional gaps to achieve their goals. I think I learned a valuable lesson about staying vigilant and trusting instincts. Maybe I should have investigated from the first warning sign. Maybe I could have been more assertive. But things happened as they had to happen. Despite the wear and tear, we managed to keep our heritage, and more importantly, I recovered my father, who returned to smiling genuinely. Today, I avoid talking much about this subject. I believe stirring up these memories might attract again a kind of energy nobody needs. Sometimes when I close my eyes to try to sleep, I remember some of the looks Rebecca gave me. I don't know if she really dealt with sinister rituals, or if it was all part of a well-executed theater to deceive us. Either way, life moved forward, and my father and I strengthened our bonds. The feed store remains open, and the orchard is more productive than ever. On clear nights, I still feel a twinge of tension when the wind sways the trees, but maybe that's just a memory of what we went through. I don't see this as something supernatural, but rather as the memory of a period when everything almost crumbled, but we kept going. If there's something I learned, it's that the greatest protection comes from not underestimating small signs, and above all, from valuing those who have always been by our side. My name is Matthew. I'm a 34-year-old data analyst at a mid-sized insurance firm on the West Coast. I've always kept a low profile, living in my small apartment, spending weekends on the couch watching true crime documentaries, rarely going out on weeknights. Until 6 months ago, I never imagined something so strange could happen to me. I'm sharing this story hoping it might serve as a warning, or at least to ease the weight I've been carrying in my mind. When I received the opportunity to lead the migration of our entire database system to a new server, my routine became brutal. I'd arrive at 7 in the morning, leave after 9 at night. Barely had time for myself. Yet I felt invigorated by the challenge. A colleague named Stephen from my department suggested we grab drinks at a cocktail bar downtown to bounce ideas off each other about some innovative features we could implement. It wasn't your typical watering hole. They served craft cocktails and had dim lighting that felt more like a lounge. I arrived at the place on a Tuesday evening after 5 o'clock, exhausted, but willing to unwind with something strong before facing the evening commute. I texted Stephen letting him know I was there. After 20 minutes of waiting, he responded that he had to cancel due to a client emergency. My first instinct was to head home, but something made me stay. Maybe I wanted those few minutes of peace before battling rush hour traffic. I ordered an old-fashioned and observed the crowd. Business types loosening their ties, groups of friends laughing, couples sharing intimate conversations. That's when I noticed her. She sat alone at the counter near the end. Unlike everyone else glued to their phones, she just stared at her untouched martini, occasionally glancing around the room. Something about her drew my attention. Perhaps it was the old-fashioned elegance of her black dress, or the way she seemed completely out of place, yet perfectly at home. I caught myself looking her way multiple times. On the third glance, our eyes met. It wasn't threatening or intrusive, but there was something in her gaze that felt like an invitation. I'm not usually the type to approach strangers, but that evening I felt compelled. Rising from my seat, trying to appear more confident than I felt, I made my way to the bar. "Evening," I said, attempting a casual smile. "Is this seat taken?" She turned slowly, as if she'd been expecting me. "Not at all." Please, her voice was soft but clear, with an accent I couldn't quite place. "I'm Matthew," I offered. "Isabella." I ordered another drink and settled beside her. The conversation flowed surprisingly well. We discussed music. She favored classical pieces I'd never heard of, the development boom in the city, how everyone seemed to be in constant motion, yet going nowhere. But something bothered me. Without me providing much information, Isabella seemed to know things. Small details that I couldn't remember mentioning. Like when she said, "You strike me as someone who values precision. Probably why you work with numbers." I had only told her I worked in tech. When I checked my watch, it was past 10. I needed to get up at 5:30 for work. As I began to say goodbye, Isabella placed her hand over mine. Her skin was surprisingly cool. "We'll cross paths again," she said. It wasn't a question. I left feeling oddly unsettled, but also curious. I don't usually make space for strangers in my life. How had I opened up so easily? The next morning at work, Stephen asked if the bar had been worthwhile. I laughed it off, saying he'd left me flying solo. "Hope you at least met someone interesting," he teased. I didn't mention Isabella. No point in making something out of nothing. Days passed. I didn't return to the bar and had no way to contact Isabella, no phone, no social media. Nearly 2 weeks later, I'd almost forgotten about her when my office phone rang. "Matthew, you have a visitor in the lobby," the receptionist said. "A Ms. Isabella Martinez." My heart jumped. How did she know where I worked? When I reached the lobby, there she stood, looking just as I remembered. Crisp white blouse, tailored pants, an expensive leather bag. "Isabella," I managed. "This is unexpected. I hope you don't mind. I was in the neighborhood for a client meeting and thought I'd stop by." "How did you find the building directory?" She smiled. Jackson and Associates Insurance is hard to miss when you know someone's name and profession. I felt paranoid asking more questions in the lobby. "There's a coffee shop around the corner. Want to grab something?" As we walked, Isabella made observations that unsettled me. She mentioned my preference for espresso over regular coffee, my habit of checking emails before bed, even the fact that I took the same route to work every day. "How could you possibly know all that?" I asked directly this time. She gave a knowing smile. People reveal more than they realize. Back at work, I found my thoughts drifting to our conversation. That evening, while grocery shopping, I got a text from an unknown number. "Hope your shopping goes well. Pick up those almond croissants from the bakery section. You mentioned they were your favorite." I checked my call log. It was Isabella's number. But when had I given it to her? When had I mentioned croissants? Over the following weeks, Isabella became a constant presence. She'd show up at the gym when I worked out, at the grocery store where I shopped on Sundays. She knew my schedule better than I did. One evening, after a particularly draining day, I found her outside my apartment building. "I thought you might need some company," she said, holding up a bottle of wine. "How did you know where I live?" "You mentioned the apartment complex during one of our conversations." "Don't you remember?" I didn't. But doubt crept in. Had I mentioned it? My memory felt fuzzy lately. My sister Sarah noticed the changes in me first. When she visited the following weekend, she commented on my appearance. "You look exhausted. Are you sleeping okay?" I told her about Isabella, though I downplayed the situation. Sarah frowned. "That doesn't sound normal. Maybe you should take a step back." Mom called a few days later. "Sarah mentioned you've been seeing someone. Is everything all right?" I hesitated. "It's complicated. You've always been a good judge of character. Trust your instincts." But my instincts felt clouded. Around Isabella, I experienced a strange fog in my thoughts. Conversations would end, and I'd realize I'd revealed information I didn't intend to share. The dreams started soon after. Vivid nightmares where I'd wake up gasping, covered in sweat. In them, I'd be searching for something in a maze-like house. Isabella's voice echoing from unseen rooms. I began finding small items around my apartment. A business card for a psychic medium left on my doormat. A small bundle of herbs tied, with red string on my car windshield. When I confronted Isabella about them, she'd seem confused, as if genuinely unaware. "Maybe you have a secret admirer," she'd tease. But her eyes held something I couldn't read. My work performance declined. I missed deadlines, forgot meetings. My boss, Mr. Jackson, pulled me aside one afternoon. "Everything okay, Matthew? You've been off your game lately. Just some personal issues. I'll get back on track." But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was slowly unraveling. The final straw came on a Friday evening. Isabella had invited me to dinner at her place, a Victorian house in an older residential area. The interior was sparse, almost clinical, except for bookshelves lined with volumes on psychology, meditation, and what appeared to be occult topics. We shared a bottle of red wine. I remember feeling unusually tired, the room seeming to spin slightly. Isabella's voice seemed to come from a distance, as she asked about my childhood fears, my dreams, my deepest regrets. I woke the next morning on her couch, disoriented and groggy. Isabella offered breakfast, acting as though nothing was unusual. But I felt wrong, like I'd betrayed myself in ways I couldn't remember. That afternoon, I made a decision. I needed help. My Aunt Diane had always been interested in spiritual matters. She knew a woman, Maria, who did energy work and spiritual consultations. I was skeptical, but desperation pushed me forward. Maria's home was in a quiet suburb. She was in her 60s, with kind eyes and a calming presence. I explained my situation carefully, without names, but conveying the strange hold Isabella seemed to have on me. Maria listened intently. After I finished, she said, "There are people who know how to create psychic bonds, whether intentionally or not. They feed off others' energy." She performed what she called a cutting of cords ceremony. For an hour, she chanted softly while burning sage and making swift motions with her hands around my body, as if severing invisible threads. "The connection is strong, but not unbreakable," she concluded. "You must actively maintain the separation. No contact, no acceptance of gifts, no meeting of eyes longer than necessary." I paid her fee and left feeling lighter but skeptical. Still, I decided to follow her advice. I changed my number. I varied my routines. I blocked Isabella on all potential contact methods. For 2 weeks, I had peace. Then the signs started appearing. A note slipped under my door. "You can't avoid what's meant to be." A package containing a small silver pendant left outside my apartment. "Wear this for protection." Isabella began showing up at my office more frequently. She'd wait outside, not approaching, just watching. When I ignored her, she'd be at the coffee shop, or at the end of my street when I drove home. One night, I woke to my phone vibrating. An unknown number. A voicemail. "I know you're trying to distance yourself, Matthew, but some connections can't be broken so easily. We're bound by something deeper than you understand." I started documenting everything. Took photos when I spotted her. Saved every message, every voicemail. My folder grew thick with evidence of her obsession. The turning point came when I found my spare apartment key, missing from its hiding spot. I hadn't told Isabella about it, but somehow she knew. I finally went to the police. Detective Rodriguez listened to my account, reviewed my evidence. "This meets the criteria for stalking," he said. "We can file for a restraining order, but understand, these situations can be complex. Sometimes the action escalates things. I can't continue like this." The restraining order was granted within a week. Isabella was served papers requiring her to stay at least 500 feet from me, my home, and my workplace. For a month, blessed silence. I began to feel like myself again. The fog lifted. My dreams normalized. I even started dating someone from work. A normal relationship built on mutual interest, not mysterious compulsion. Then one Tuesday morning, I found an envelope addressed to me, left in my mailbox despite the restraining order. Inside was a single photograph. It showed me sleeping in my bed, taken recently based on the book on my nightstand. On the back, handwritten in red ink, "Physical distance means nothing. We'll always be connected." I called Detective Rodriguez immediately. Within hours, they had enough to arrest Isabella for violating the restraining order and breaking and entering. The investigation that followed revealed disturbing truths. Isabella wasn't who she claimed to be. Her real name was Samantha Torres, and she had a history of similar behaviors with other men. Psychological evaluations suggested a condition called cognitive obsession disorder, combined with narcissistic personality traits. She pleaded no contest and received a sentence that included psychiatric treatment and 5 years of probation. The judge made it clear, any contact with me would result in immediate jail time. That was 8 months ago. Life has slowly returned to normal. I still check my locks twice. I still vary my routines. But the constant fear has faded. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never walked up to that bar. If I'd just finished my drink and gone home that November evening. But some encounters, I've learned, are like storms. They arrive suddenly, reshape your landscape, and leave you permanently changed. I've kept everything from that time in a box in my closet. The voicemails, the notes, the photograph. Not out of fear, but as a reminder. A reminder that people aren't always what they seem. That intuition matters. And that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help when you need it. The woman I'm seeing now, Jessica, knows the full story. She understands why I sometimes wake from nightmares, why I'm particular about certain boundaries. Everyone has a past, she says, and yours taught you something important. She's right. I learned that psychic connections might exist in forms we don't understand. That some people have the ability to weave themselves into your thoughts and dreams. That spiritual protection, whether real or placebo, sometimes provides the psychological strength to break free. I learned that my mother's instincts were right. Trust your gut when something feels wrong. And I learned that even in our modern, rational world, there are mysteries that can't be easily explained. Most importantly, I learned that I'm stronger than I knew, that I could face something that challenged my understanding of reality and come out the other side intact. Sometimes on quiet evenings, I wonder where Samantha is now. If she's getting help, if she's learned to form healthy connections. But mostly, I focus on the present, on building genuine relationships based on respect and mutual understanding. The silver pendant she sent sits at the bottom of that box. I never wore it. Maria told me it might have been some kind of binding charm. I'll never know for sure. What I do know is this. Every day I wake up free from that invisible weight feels like a victory. A small triumph of will over manipulation, clarity over confusion. And I'm grateful for that freedom. Every single day. Some stories stay with you, no matter how much time passes. Now I'll tell you about an experience that shook me to my core, the moment I lived through it. Pay attention, because this is one of those stories that seems to whisper something to you, somewhere between fear and courage. I live in northern Arizona, and what happened was the most challenging ordeal my husband and I have ever faced. It was during a long holiday weekend, so we decided to take a road trip. We were driving through the Mogollon Rim Highway, descending toward the high desert. Anyone familiar with this road knows the descent is far more treacherous than the climb, with its tight switchbacks and steep grades. Since we had our young children with us, we were taking every possible precaution. Even though my husband knew every detail of this route, he still drove with extreme caution. Not even 7 minutes had passed since we began the descent when an icy chill ran down my spine, something common to feel in that area. Instinctively, I turned around to check on the kids' car seats. They were sleeping peacefully in their restraints, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw next. I had heard countless stories about the woman in white, the one who appears on this highway, hitching rides on buses or glimpsed by drivers. Many believe she's connected to the accidents that happened there. I'll admit I never gave those stories any credit until that moment. Between my children's car seats sat a female figure dressed in white, head bowed, hair covering her face. Panic froze me in place. I spun forward, my mind seized by terror, and a kind of static that muffled all sound, even the car's engine. My muscles locked. I wanted to look at my husband, but I couldn't even manage that. Still, from the corner of my eye, I could sense that presence, motionless, silent, seated between my babies. "Do you trust me?" I asked my husband, my voice trembling, barely audible. "Of course I do," he replied. "And do you trust in God?" Though he didn't take his eyes off the road, I could see the strain on his face. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to understand. "Just listen to what I'm about to say. Don't look back, not in the rearview mirror either. No matter what happens, don't look. Just get us out of here safely." While he drove, I kept praying. My fear was that he would notice what I was seeing, and, overwhelmed by terror, lose control of the vehicle like so many others who had plunged into the canyons of that region. Behind us, the woman remained still, an oppressive and threatening presence. All I could think about were the wrecked cars scattered at the bottom of the gorges, marking the lives the Mogollon Rim had already claimed. I kept my eyes fixed on my husband, ensuring he wouldn't dare look back. I could still see her from the corner of my eye. Just a few minutes later, as we approached the final curves of the descent, that white figure began to fade, darkening until she disappeared completely. It was a relief, but also a disturbing moment. I'm deeply grateful for the strength he had to follow my request and keep his eyes on the road. Because when I finally looked back myself, I experienced a fear impossible to describe. As terrified as I was, I controlled myself. A scream or any thoughtless movement could have endangered my children. That might have been exactly what that presence wanted. I'm certain that if I had lost control, my husband would have too. And today we'd be just another statistic, another car among so many destroyed in the ravines. An incident that would be attributed to treacherous curves or the strong mountain winds. Accidents that people prefer to explain rationally, ignoring any connection to the woman in white. My husband didn't fully believe what I told him, and in a way, I'm grateful for that. He admitted noticing something from the corner of his eye, but avoided giving it attention. However, I know that if we ever have to cross that highway again, especially at night, he'll follow without question if I say, "For nothing in this world, look at the back seat." The memory of that night still haunts me. I can close my eyes and see every detail. The way her white dress seemed to glow in the darkness of the car, how her hair fell in perfectly straight lines, obscuring features I thank God I never clearly saw. The children slept through it all, unaware of how close we came to becoming another local legend. That road has taken so many. Some say it's the sharp turns. Others blame the elevation changes or poor visibility at twilight. But those of us who have seen her know differently. She waits for the right moment, the right car, the right driver who might glance in the rearview mirror at just the wrong time. I often wonder about the others who have seen her. Did they all make it home to tell their stories? Or are some of them now part of the landscape below? Their vehicles twisted metal memorials to a moment of curiosity, a glance at the wrong time. What I know for certain is this: there are places where the veil between worlds grows thin, where ancient roads carry more than just traffic. The Mogollon Rim is one such place, and the woman in white is its guardian, or perhaps its collector. I was lucky that day. We were lucky. Sometimes I still feel that chill down my spine when driving mountain roads, even familiar ones. And always, I remember that night and the silent figure who rode with us down that treacherous descent. Some mysteries are better left unexplored, some legends better left unverified. The price of proof might just be more than you're willing to pay. When I was around 11 or 12 years old, my father landed a high-paying job that took us from a remote town in Idaho to settle in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Maybe took us isn't quite right. My parents were actually thrilled about the move. It was a decision they made almost instantly. And within 20 days, we left our cramped, poorly maintained house in a rundown neighborhood for a massive home in one of the most beautiful areas of Cape Cod. You might wonder how I felt about all this back then. I was a pretty introspective kid who preferred my own company, so I didn't feel like I was leaving behind any strong connections or childhood friendships. I simply didn't have any friends. Years later, my parents told me that one of the reasons for this move was to give me a fresh start. But that's beside the point. The truth is, the move didn't shake me up, and I adapted easily. It wasn't hard, considering how much our life improved. As I mentioned, the new house was enormous, and even my 11-year-old self knew we wouldn't worry about money anymore. I won't bore you describing every corner of the house. I'll just mention what really mattered. I had 2 older brothers, Daniel and Michael, and the backyard was undoubtedly our favorite part. There was a large, winding hedge perfect for games like tag, hide and seek, or whatever else we imagined. But it was the treehouse in the right corner of the property that truly captivated us. Each home on the block was surrounded by tall trees, and our treehouse stood right in that wooded area. Actually, calling it a treehouse undersells it. It was more like a suspended fortress. It wasn't some simple weekend project by a handy father. It was something monumental, involving 9 or 10 nearby trees. It had 4 different levels, and even a real staircase, not those makeshift ones with loose boards. It was clear this had been built by a professional. For a long time, my brothers and I spent our afternoons there. It was without doubt the highlight of our days. But eventually, my brothers grew tired of the treehouse. They were older and had entered that teenage phase where nothing seems fun anymore. I was the only one who kept going up there, which was somewhat frustrating. I felt sad being practically left out, but nothing I said brought my brothers back. One day, while climbing up to the treehouse, I found a folded piece of paper tucked in a corner. I remember exactly what that note said. "Hi, I'm the Marshmallow Man. It's nice to meet you. What's your name?" I got way too excited. I thought it was one of my brothers trying to play with me, so I decided to play along, hoping it would encourage them to return to the treehouse. There was a stack of paper that hadn't been there before, so full of enthusiasm. I grabbed one of the markers we kept up there and wrote a response, leaving the note with my name in the same spot where I'd found the other one. That night, I thought about asking my brothers which one was the Marshmallow Man, but the fear of ruining the game kept me silent. In the following days, as soon as I got home from school, I'd rush straight to the treehouse. There was always a new note waiting for me. At first, the messages were simple, something that certainly could have come from them. I enjoyed it, but as time passed, things started to get weird. The Marshmallow Man began asking questions that sounded strange, even for my brothers. Things like, "What's your favorite time of day to play?" Or "What do you eat for breakfast?" Some questions seemed harmless, but others stood out to me, like which window in the house looks out from your room. Even now, thinking about it gives me chills. Back then, I didn't notice anything wrong and answered without thinking, certain it was just a game. Everything changed with the next note. He asked me something disturbing, something about the smell of my pajamas. That was enough to unsettle me deeply. I ran inside, confronted my brothers, and demanded explanations. They just laughed and denied any involvement, even mocked me, saying I was letting my imagination run wild. I left the room furious, tears mixing sadness and anger. Someone was lying, I was sure of it. I decided to take action. Instead of telling my parents, I came up with a plan. But nothing could have prepared me for what was to come. That night, already in bed, I heard tapping on the window. My heart felt like it wanted to escape my chest. I was paralyzed, completely overtaken by fear. The silence of the darkness only made everything more frightening. I remained motionless until exhaustion won over, and I managed to fall asleep. The next morning, when I opened the curtains, my blood ran cold. Outside the window, several marshmallows were stuck to the glass. I was livid. This had to be my brother's doing. But I decided not to show it. I pretended not to notice and spent the day without mentioning anything. When night came, I was ready. As soon as I heard the tapping again, I sprang from bed and opened the curtains, prepared to catch them red-handed. But it wasn't them on the other side. An old, repulsive man stared at me. His eyes were yellowish, his teeth appeared rotten, and the smile he gave when he realized I was listening was terrifying. I let out the loudest scream of my life. The feeling that I was going to die overwhelmed me. My parents burst into the room, but the man was already gone. That night turned into a nightmare for all of us. The police were called and searched every corner of the yard, the house, and the treehouse. Nothing was found. Neighbors came to find out what had happened, reacting with horror when they heard the story. I told everything I knew to the police and my parents, but there wasn't much to say. They collected the notes as evidence, though I doubt they helped with anything. The man never appeared again after the incident. My parents decided I couldn't go up to the treehouse anymore. Not that I had any desire to return there. It's been some time since I moved from that house, but my parents still live there. Whenever I visit, I can't help but glance at the treehouse. It's still, without doubt, one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had. I survived the thunderstorms that had swept across the estate so many times, but they were now behind me. A quarter century had passed since we left that piece of land outside of Monterey. 25 years since my family decided to abandon it, selling for a pittance. We no longer wanted to carry the heavy memories that seemed to follow us like shadows. Despite my efforts to forget, there are nights when sleep eludes me. What we experienced in that place still echoes in my dreams, and I always wake with the sensation that something is watching me from the corners of the room, as if the presences that inhabited that space weren't ready to let us go completely. My father used to say it was an unmissable opportunity. The estate, with its vast fields and an imposing 3-story mansion, was being sold for an irresistible price. It was an ancient construction surrounded by tall trees that seemed like grim sentinels. For my parents, that place was a project, the chance to build an ideal home. For me, from the moment I set foot there, it felt different, almost alive, as if it was waiting for something or someone. I clearly remember the day we arrived. It was midsummer, and the heat in Northern California was oppressive. Lucas, Alina, and Sarah, my younger siblings, ran excitedly through the enormous yard, planning the adventures they would have in the hidden corners of the property. I, on the other hand, stood frozen before the main entrance, observing the shadows that curiously seemed denser than they should have been under the noon sun. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to ignore it. The house certainly had a unique charm: thick adobe walls, high ceilings, and windows that framed the landscape like natural paintings. Even so, the silence that filled every corner deeply unsettled me. It wasn't an ordinary silence, but one that seemed to carry something with it, something lying in wait, hidden in plains I couldn't reach. My mother, on the other hand, fell in love with the kitchen as soon as she saw it. The space was ample, with a large antique fireplace that seemed to have been used by generations past. While exploring the place, she asked me with a smile on her face, "What do you think, Brenda? It'll be beautiful after we paint the walls and install a new stove." I agreed with a nod, but without sharing her excitement. There was something in the kitchen that made me want to leave quickly, as if staying too long would be an invitation for something or someone to reveal themselves. The first weeks passed without major events, or at least that's how it seemed. My parents were busy cleaning and organizing, while my siblings enjoyed the yard. I tried to distract myself by helping, but I couldn't ignore certain detailed sounds coming from the walls, inexplicable drafts that made doors suddenly slam, or even lights that flickered for no apparent reason. The first truly significant experience happened one night while my mother and I were in the kitchen. It was late, and my father hadn't yet returned from the city where he worked. We were preparing dinner when suddenly I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. My mother noticed my expression and asked, "What's wrong?" "Nothing," I said. "I thought someone was here." She tried to minimize the occurrence, changing the subject. "It's just an old house, honey. These things happen. It must be the wood settling or the plumbing." But I knew it wasn't that. That same night, as I lay in bed, I heard a rhythmic sound coming from the walls of my room. At first, I thought it might be an animal, perhaps a rodent. But when the sound began to form a clear rhythm, like an intentional tapping, I knew something was very wrong. My siblings Lucas, Alina, and Sarah loved spending afternoons exploring the yard. It was immense, full of fruit-laden trees and narrow trails that seemed to stretch for miles. They always returned covered in dirt, with broad smiles. But one evening, they brought back a different story. At the dinner table, Alina mentioned, "Today we played with some children." My parents, surprised, exchanged glances. "Children? Who were they?" "I don't know," Lucas explained with a casual gesture. "They were just there. They said they lived here. My parents thought it was just their imagination, but I sensed there was something more. The next day, I decided to follow them. I watched as they played in the yard, running and laughing, but there was no one else there. Still, I could hear laughter in the distance, so soft it seemed carried by the wind. When I asked where the children were, Sarah pointed to a tree at the back of the yard, where an old swing hung. No one was there, but the swing swayed gently despite the still air. The woman appeared for the first time on an afternoon when my mother was away in town. I had been left responsible for the house and was cleaning the living room when I heard a noise coming from the kitchen. It was the sound of utensils, as if someone was preparing something. I imagined my mother had returned early, but upon entering, I froze. Near the stove, a woman with an antique apron and hair tied in a disheveled bun seemed to be stirring something in a pot. But the stove was off, and her hands held nothing. When I took a step back, she turned her head slightly but didn't face me directly. I remained there, petrified, until she simply vanished into the air. When I told my parents, I received looks of disbelief. "You're imagining things, Brenda," my father said, trying to calm me. But I knew what I had seen, and it wouldn't be the last time. Storms in Northern California were always intense, but at the estate, they brought something different. During one of those rainy nights, we saw the shadow for the first time. We were gathered in the living room watching television when we heard heavy footsteps in the yard. They seemed to belong to something enormous. Despite our pleas, my father grabbed a flashlight and went out to investigate. From the window, we witnessed the scene. Through the rain, just a few meters from the house, stood the figure. It was immense, exceeding 6 feet tall, and seemed made of dense darkness. It had no face or clear features, but its presence was suffocating. My father pointed the flashlight, but the thing didn't disappear. Slowly, it turned in his direction, as if it knew it was being observed. After some interminable moments, it vanished into the air. My father returned pale, with trembling hands. "That wasn't a man," he murmured while locking all the doors. Things began spiraling out of control. The woman in the kitchen appeared more frequently, and the children in the yard had lost their aura of innocence. The shadow that appeared during stormy nights drew ever closer to the house. My father, always so rational, tried to find explanations, but even he knew something was terribly wrong. After months facing the inexplicable, he finally made a decision. "We're leaving. I don't want any of you to spend another day in this place." Without delay, we gathered our belongings and abandoned the estate. A few weeks later, my father sold it, accepting any offer that would free him from it. We never returned, but the memories of that place still haunt me. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can hear the sound of those footsteps in the yard. And I can say with certainty, it's the most terrifying sound I've ever heard in my entire life. What I'm about to share with you is something I do because I believe someone needs to hear this story. It's a tale I've kept locked away for years, shared only with Sarah, who lived through it with me, my mother, my best friend, and a handful of others. To be honest, telling them was a mistake. It all happened in a small motel just off Route 66, a few yards from a state highway, right before you reach a small town that I prefer not to name. Those familiar with the area will probably figure it out. It's about an hour and a half drive from Phoenix. When my grandfather, who was more like a father to me, passed away, I developed an obsession with back roads, the same ones he'd always invite me to explore, but that I'd somehow avoided at all costs. My grandfather had crossed the country from coast to coast in his 1984 Winnebago. He'd driven through places like Flagstaff, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and even made it all the way to Florida, making the most of his retirement years. That RV was the only thing he left me. No note, no explanation. I always believed he expected me to continue traveling those roads he loved so much. I can't stand driving in the city, but out on the open road. That's different. There's something relaxing, almost magical about it that I quickly discovered was addictive. My grandfather knew this all too well. Sarah, my girlfriend at the time, was my most frequent companion on these adventures. She had a demanding job that ate up most of her time, but whenever she got time off, she'd join me, even knowing we rarely had a specific destination in mind. It was on that Thursday when everything happened. We left the city with a place in mind, but about an hour before arriving, the Winnebago started shuddering violently, as if a wheel was about to come off or the engine was going to die. I got nervous. Unlike my grandfather, I didn't know the RV that well, and beyond basic maintenance, I didn't understand much about mechanics. I slowed down, and just a few miles ahead, we spotted a weathered sign on the roadside pointing to a motel. We decided to stop, rest a bit, grab a bite to eat, and spend the night there. It seemed like a good idea to check the RV's problem with a clear head the next morning and decide whether to continue or turn back. From the outside, the motel had a strange charm. Guest rooms were arranged around a pool that didn't look like it had been cleaned in decades. The accumulated leaves on the water were so thick you couldn't even see the bottom. For all we knew, there could have been furniture submerged down there, and nobody would notice. There didn't seem to be any other guests. The place was deserted, but we liked what they offered, so we decided to stay. The heat was intense, though a light drizzle was beginning to fall. Sarah asked if there was a restaurant in the motel or nearby. The man who attended us, probably the only employee, replied that there was one about 2 kilometers away, almost in the town. But if we wanted, he could prepare something in the motel's own restaurant. We accepted without imagining what this meant. He left the reception and went to the restaurant, where he turned on the lights in a place that, like the rest of the motel, seemed abandoned. Not many people come here anymore, and the few who do, when they see the place, end up leaving, he remarked. We didn't pay much attention. Honestly, it seemed like he wasn't quite right in the head. There was something peculiar about him, but he was a kind person, and we were on a busy highway. We didn't think staying there would be risky. If that motel and the old man had been isolated, we never would have stayed. But the situation seemed safe enough. The man was overly excited. Clearly, he hadn't had guests in a long time. While he unlocked the restaurant, a small room with 4 tables overlooking the pool on one side and the highway on the other, the rain grew heavier. That's when a red car pulled up at the reception. The old man's enthusiasm bordered on euphoria, as if he could hardly believe that in one night 2 cars had arrived. He ran to greet them. It was a man in his mid-30s, accompanied by 2 young, beautiful women. They had also had car trouble and decided to stop when they saw the sign by the road. The rain made it impossible to see far ahead. The motel owner was thrilled to receive them, perhaps remembering times when this place didn't seem like a graveyard worthy of a horror movie. He offered them the same as us, a discounted room. In a place like that, they accepted. He said he'd prepare dinner, and with everyone's consent, asked for patience. He'd need to go to the village to get what was needed for a meal that would serve all 5 guests. We agreed, mainly because he brought us some warm beers. They weren't cold, but at least they weren't as hot as the suffocating air that combined extreme heat with rain humidity. It was better than nothing. With the man in the village, the 5 of us remained in the makeshift restaurant. That's when the girls noticed the pool and decided to dive in. Neither the man accompanying them, nor my girlfriend, nor I had the courage to follow them. We avoided discovering what was hidden beneath the floating leaves. We tried to find a switch to turn on the lighting. Only one bulb lit up, and even then it kept flickering constantly, going out for several seconds at a time. The girls got into the pool while Sarah and I chatted with the other guest. They were going to the same place as us, and just like what happened to us, car trouble and the rain made them stop here. The coincidence made me uneasy. I was still thinking about it when a scream cut through the silence. One of the girls had disappeared for seconds and returned to the surface screaming for help. She claimed something had grabbed her ankle, trying to drag her down. It must be a branch or some kind of debris at the bottom, I suggested, trying to reassure her. She got upset. I'm not stupid. I know very well the difference between a branch and a hand grabbing my ankle to pull me down, she sobbed, tears streaming down her face. Her friend laughed at her, swimming around the pool, pushing leaves with her arms, trying to show there was nothing there. She repeated that it was all imagination, insisting she come back in. She pushed the leaves forcefully while the other, terrified, tried to make her stop. Don't look for anything. Get out of there now, she cried, voice gripped with terror. The more she panicked, the more her friend laughed. The tension really escalated when we heard the motel owner returning from the store, shouting from afar. Get out of there, you idiot. Hey, there's no need to talk to her like that. The man accompanying the women responded in a firm but polite tone. The motel owner stared at him with irritation-charged eyes. She can't stay in that pool, he affirmed, standing at the edge of the water waiting for the girl to get out. After she finally left the pool, The man went to the kitchen muttering incomprehensible words, clearly upset. From then on, he kept coming and going, as if wanting to make sure nobody would dare get back into the water. Before disappearing from view, he turned off the pool light and informed us that dinner would be ready in 15 minutes, asking everyone to wait in their rooms. The rain persisted. Sarah and I went to our room and ended up discussing the relationship between those three guests. They seemed too close to just be friends, but of course, we didn't want to make judgments. We just wondered how something like that worked. This conversation distracted us more than the girl's incident in the pool. To us, it was obvious she must have been confused. It never crossed our minds that something real could be under the water trying to pull her down. Suddenly, we heard noise outside. The two women came running out, followed by the man who, though not running, was hurrying, dragging the two suitcases they'd arrived with. They got in the car and honked nonstop, as if demanding he hurry. He threw the suitcases in the trunk carelessly and sped down the road. The darkness was so thick it seemed to have swallowed the car completely. Soon after, the room phone rang. It was an old rotary model. The motel owner's hoarse and firm voice informed us that dinner was served. We rushed toward the restaurant, trying to avoid getting wet in the persistent drizzle. "I guess they're not coming back, right? There'll be leftover food," I commented as we entered. The man took several seconds to respond, so long I thought he hadn't heard me. "I've gotten used to the fact that few stay until dawn," he said, looking at me with a smile that seemed more like an effort. That's when I noticed, for the first time, how many teeth were missing from his mouth. Sarah and I ate with some suspicion, but our hunger outweighed doubts about the food. Sarah, in her sociable nature, tried to make conversation with the man, but he only responded with monosyllables like someone who didn't want to talk. After a while, we said we were going to rest. The man went to the reception, turned off all the lights, and locked the motel door. We found this strange, but decided that nothing bad would happen. As we passed by the pool, now in total darkness, I clearly heard something moving in the water. I didn't have the courage to look. Sarah heard it too, but didn't say a word. I don't remember well what we talked about in the room before sleeping, but I remember we talked until sleep overcame us. The motel plunged into complete darkness. Not even the corridor lights were on. The previously busy highway now seemed like a distant world. The silence was absolute. I was sleeping, but something woke me slightly. I heard a soft sound, like something lighting up. I half opened my eyes. Through the thin curtain covering the corridor window, I could see a faint glow, as if some light in the motel had been turned on. Sarah whispered my name. I was so exhausted, I pretended to be deeply asleep and didn't respond. She got up, peeked out the window, left the room for a few seconds, and returned, closing the door with the chain lock. She approached slowly. "Please wake up. There's something at the bottom of the pool." Sarah had always been a strong woman. I'd never heard her speak with such fear. Her voice sounded like a frightened child's. I opened my eyes, confused, and asked what was happening. She said she didn't want to stay there another minute, that we needed to leave. I still didn't understand. I got up, but she grabbed my arm and asked me not to make noise. She said the man was in the corridor. I tried to calm her, saying everything would be okay, that she should trust me. I walked to the door with Sarah following, gripping my arms tightly. Her hands trembled, her fingers digging into me. She really had seen something. I needed to understand what was happening and find an explanation to reassure her. I opened the door carefully, saying I was just going to peek at the pool. From the window, you couldn't see anything. I had to go out into the corridor. Sarah stayed in the room. Each step I took in the corridor felt like it weighed a ton, as if time was slowing down, and I was reluctant to continue. The pool light was on but flickering irregularly. The rain had stopped. The accumulated leaves on one side left the center of the pool visible, revealing the deepest part. When the light came on again, I saw it. There was a woman at the bottom of the pool. Her body remained motionless, and her long hair floated tangled like submerged threads in the water. My heart raced. How could someone be there at the bottom? The lights went out, and in that brief moment of darkness, my mind searched for explanations. Maybe it was a mannequin that fell in the water, a forgotten dummy, or something more macabre, a body hidden by the motel owner. Maybe that's what he was trying to prevent us from discovering, whatever was there. If it were someone alive, maybe they'd touched the girl earlier to ask for help. The lights came on again. What I saw this time froze my blood. The figure at the bottom of the pool turned its head toward me, as if it could see me. Then it began to walk. Yes, walk, not swim to hide under the leaves. This made no sense. It was impossible. At the same time, I saw the man climbing the stairs toward us. Without thinking, I ran back to the room, locking the door and pushing furniture against it. Sarah looked at me terrified, and in that moment, everything went dark. I woke some time later, almost 4 in the morning. Sarah was hugging me, trying to calm me down. She said the man had looked through the window, but didn't do anything. He didn't try to come in. In that instant, I felt a fear I'd always dreaded coming true, failing to protect her. During every trip, this thought haunted me. Now, when the danger became real, I had to face my inability to care for her. I got up, still half dazed, and said we needed to leave. Sarah began packing the few things we'd taken from our bag. While packing, she mentioned that the pool light had stopped flickering about half an hour ago. I moved the furniture, blocking the door carefully, just enough to open a passage. In the corridor, I peered toward the pool. Everything was shrouded in darkness with no apparent sign, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I quickly checked if the motel owner was around, fearing he might see us escaping, even though we'd already paid for the night and dinner. Something about the idea of crossing paths with him again made me freeze. I didn't see him. I called Sarah, and we left in silence, stepping lightly to avoid any noise. We went down the stairs, but when we were halfway, the man's cry froze us. He came running from some distant point, shouting something we didn't understand or maybe didn't want to understand. The 2 wooden doors leading outside toward the Winnebago weren't locked. We pushed hard, ran to the vehicle, and managed to turn it on before the old man got close. We didn't stop until we reached the village. There I parked near what looked like a police station. We stayed inside the RV, waiting for dawn. We slept maybe half an hour. We didn't talk about what we'd seen. It seemed pointless to look for explanations, and the memory was something we didn't want to carry. Even so, I just had to close my eyes to see that figure at the bottom of the pool again. As the day progressed, we tried to disconnect. We walked around the village, looking for a way to leave it behind. Shortly before beginning our trip back to Phoenix, while looking for something to eat in the main square, I saw the other motel guest. He was alone, sitting at a table in the restaurant next to ours. There was no sign of the two girls. As soon as he saw me, he got up and left without saying a word. We left before dusk. When we passed the highway in front of the motel, daylight softened what seemed so terrifying in our memory. The vegetation-covered walls and closed door gave the place an air of abandonment. There was no sign of guests or the man who took care of it. We continued on, deciding to look for the sign that announced the motel, thinking of removing it to prevent others from arriving there like we did. But the sign was no longer there. When I tell this story, people say we mistakenly stayed at an abandoned motel, inhabited by a former owner who went mad years ago. Some try to rationalize it, but nobody has an explanation for the woman underwater. Many insist it was my imagination, a trick of fear, but I know it wasn't. And the impact it had on Sarah. After I dropped her off at home that night, she never answered my calls or returned my messages again. A year later, I happened to run into her by chance. Her hair was almost completely white, and she seemed to have aged a decade. I heard she became deeply religious, and now devotes herself entirely to faith. I hope she found peace. Though years have passed, I've relived that night in 2 occasions. In the night air by an empty pool, I clearly heard sounds in the water, as if something was there, even knowing it was completely empty. This memory has been circulating through my thoughts constantly these past few days. My youngest child, Alex, just started college, and while it fills me with pride, the house feels quieter than it's ever been, silent almost too much, to be honest. The funny thing is, when your kids are young, you dream of having moments of peace and quiet. But when they finally arrive, they're less welcoming than you imagined. For some reason, Alex's departure seems to have unlocked a dormant part of my mind, bringing forward a specific memory that's been replaying itself for both me and my wife. They say that reliving memories of your children's childhood is common at this stage, so perhaps this isn't so unexpected. I can clearly remember how Alex was as a child, full of energy and curiosity, always getting into adventures. But one of these memories is a bit harder to digest. Alex was 9 years old when this happened, and to this day, I still can't fully comprehend it. I'm a carpenter by trade, always had a knack for manual work. Back then, I was even more active, always ready to start new projects. One of the projects I'm most proud of was the treehouse I built for Alex in our backyard. It's still standing there today. It wasn't a simple project, just with a makeshift platform. I made proper walls, a roof, solid wooden stairs leading to the entrance. The structure was robust. My idea was for it to be like a little piece of our home for Alex, and I think I achieved that. My wife, Sarah, wasn't initially thrilled with the idea. She thought the construction was too high and dangerous. But Alex had always been a child who loved climbing trees, so I figured it would be safer to give them a well-built ladder than to let them climb up fragile branches. In the end, Sarah came around, and Alex was delighted. Maybe I should explain the setting better so everything makes sense. Our house was at the end of a cul-de-sac, surrounded by a fairly wooded area. The backyard was bordered by a forest preserve, and that was one of the reasons we fell in love with the house. We liked privacy and a more peaceful environment. It was perfect for us. More than once, friends and relatives got lost trying to find our place. The backyard, while not huge, allowed a complete view of the treehouse from our bedroom window. That's why I chose that specific spot to build it. I wanted to be able to keep watch in case something happened while Alex was playing. Although I couldn't see inside the little house because of the walls, I had a clear view of the ladder leading up to it. For a good while, everything seemed normal. Alex spent hours playing in the treehouse, while their older sibling had already left this type of play behind. Alex would stay up there alone. I can't remember exactly when it started, but at some point, Alex began mentioning an imaginary friend named Marcus. We knew it was imaginary because there were no children by that name around. Imaginary friends aren't that uncommon, but Alex was 9, a bit old for that. I found it amusing and harmless, but something about the situation unsettled me. It was odd, especially since Alex had never been the type to invent imaginary friends. Although I initially didn't give it much importance, after all, they were just a child. The situation began to worry me more when I noticed Alex was spending hours in the treehouse. What intrigued me was that Alex wouldn't bring toys or anything to pass the time, just their own imagination. I had already told them not to carry heavy things to avoid accidents, and there weren't video games or anything like that up there. In a moment of curiosity, I asked about this friend Marcus. Alex reacted strangely, saying Marcus was very shy and didn't like being mentioned. When I questioned why they spent so much time in the treehouse, Alex explained that Marcus only wanted to play there and avoided coming into the house. The response disturbed me. An imaginary friend with such specific preferences. I found it strange. I researched and discovered that some children limit interaction with their imaginary friends to certain places. I accepted it, though it felt unusual. Sarah, my wife, wasn't as calm about it. She thought Alex was taking it too far, and I agreed somewhat. However, we weren't overprotective parents. As long as Alex did well in school and kept up with their responsibilities, we gave freedom during their free time. On weekends, they played with the neighborhood kids until dark, riding bikes, playing tag, normal activities. We trusted Alex because our child was well behaved and didn't get into fights. That's why I worried when they came home one Saturday with a black eye. While cleaning the injury, I asked what had happened. They stayed quiet, but I insisted, promising I wouldn't be mad. What they said next chilled me to the bone. They claimed they had fought with Marcus. It took me a few seconds to remember who they were talking about. I explained that it wasn't time for make-believe stories. But instead of laughing and admitting it, Alex cried and locked themselves in their room. Sarah suggested they had fought with some neighbor kid and were hiding the truth. She wanted me to tear down the treehouse immediately, but I hesitated. Building it had been hard work, and destroying it seemed drastic. I promised to talk seriously with Alex and put an end to the exaggeration. But they wouldn't come out of their room or listen to me. That night, I decided to investigate on my own. I climbed up to the treehouse, and what I found turned my stomach. There were children's shoes and socks scattered on the floor, all dirty and worn. They weren't Alex's or my older child's. We had donated their old shoes long ago. And that wasn't all. Spread across the floor were food wrappers, plastic bags, kitchen utensils, and even some dirty plates. However, what caught my attention most were the pencil drawings on the treehouse walls. They were figures of wild animals, a fox, a bear, some deer. I can't remember all of them, but I know they were only animals. The most disturbing was an image that looked like a giant spider, with its face scribbled black. It was truly sinister. I immediately climbed down and confronted Alex about what I'd seen. They explained that Marcus only liked to talk if he was fed, which is why they had to bring food and snacks. They also said the shoes and socks scattered around belonged to Marcus, who was very forgetful. That was enough for me. I decided to forbid Alex from returning to the treehouse. I knew they were lying, and I wanted them to admit the truth. I was absolutely certain they had collected those things from around the neighborhood and created this whole story. Sarah was deeply concerned about Alex's psychological well-being. So was I. We considered seeking professional help if the situation worsened. But one night, everything changed. While looking out our bedroom window, I noticed movement near the treehouse. At first, I was angry, thinking Alex had disobeyed my orders. But what I saw next left me stunned. A child of frail and pale appearance was descending the treehouse stairs. It wasn't Alex, and they didn't look like any of the kids who lived nearby. Their clothes were filthy, and they moved strangely, like someone who hadn't eaten in a long time. I ran outside, shouting for them to stop. As soon as I opened the back door, the boy rushed toward the forest. I tried to catch him, but he was incredibly fast. In seconds, he vanished among the trees. Sarah immediately contacted the other parents in the neighborhood, but all the children were home safe. We called the police, who searched the forest thoroughly for over an hour but found nothing. No reports of missing children had been filed in the area. It was completely inexplicable. With my permission, the police spoke with Alex about the boy I'd seen. What they revealed was terrifying. According to Alex, Marcus claimed to be a magical boy who lived in the forest with other friends, figures he called bear, fox, and other similar names. Whenever Marcus appeared, he would ask Alex to leave our family and join him and his friends in the woods. When Alex refused, Marcus would get angry and make strange, frightening sounds. I can't understand why Alex never told me any of this before. Since then, I've carried a feeling of guilt, thinking I could have better protected my child. The police conducted extensive searches, but found no sign of Marcus or anyone else living in the forest. We never heard from him again. Sarah, being quite superstitious, believes Marcus was never real. I, on the other hand, don't believe in these things, but the way she talks about it still makes me uneasy. To be honest, I don't know what's more frightening, imagining that something supernatural approached my child, or considering the possibility that unknown and dangerous people might be hiding in the woods behind our house. The treehouse still stands in our backyard, a weathered reminder of that strange autumn when my child's imagination, or reality, blurred the lines between what we understand and what remains unexplainable. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.